What if everything you were taught about Jesus was only the surface, and the real message was hidden in a state of consciousness you were never trained to see? Once you hear this, you may never read Scripture the same way again. I've been sitting with something I can't easily shake off, and I want to be careful with how I say this, because I don't want to sound like I'm claiming I have answers that others don't. I'm not speaking from certainty. I'm speaking from something closer to disturbance, like when a familiar idea suddenly stops feeling as simple as it used to. Because the more I looked into certain teachings attributed to Jesus, the more I started noticing something strange. Not in the text itself at first, but in how I had always been taught to read it. It felt like I was only ever seeing the surface of something that might have been pointing much deeper inward. And I want to ask you something directly, like I've been asking myself. What if we were never actually shown the full depth of what these words were trying to point toward? Not because something was intentionally hidden in a dramatic sense, but because maybe we were never taught how to look at it differently. There's a moment in Scripture that kept repeating in my mind, almost like it refused to leave me alone. The eye is the lamp of the body. At first, it sounds simple, familiar even, something you could pass over without stopping. But that's exactly what worried me the most, because the most powerful ideas are often the ones we stop questioning, simply because we think we already understand them. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't. I started asking myself why something so simple would be described in such a precise way. Why the eye? Why single? Why light? And the more I sat with it, the more I felt like it wasn't just talking about sight in the way we normally think about sight, but something more internal, something closer to perception itself. Now, before we go any further, I want to welcome you into this space. If you're new here, I'm glad you're here with me. And if you've been following these reflections already, I appreciate you staying on this journey. You're watching Bible Talesis 07, and what we do here is not about forcing conclusions. It's about exploring the layers beneath familiar words and asking deeper questions together. Because I've noticed something about all of us. We don't just want information. We want meaning. We want something that makes us pause, reflect, and sometimes even question the way we've been seeing everything. And I think that's where this begins to matter. Because if there is even a small possibility that this I Jesus spoke of was pointing toward a different kind of awareness, then that changes everything about how we understand not just the teaching, but ourselves. And I don't say that lightly. I say it because I've felt that tension personally. The tension between what I was told something means and what it starts to feel like when I sit with it long enough in silence. It doesn't resolve quickly. It lingers. It pulls at your attention in quiet moments when nothing else is distracting you. And that's why I want you to stay with me until the end of this conversation. Because what we are slowly moving toward is not just interpretation. It's something closer to realization through reflection. If this is something that speaks to you, I want to ask you to support this channel by subscribing. It truly helps me continue creating these kinds of deep, thoughtful explorations, and it means a lot more than you might think. But more importantly, I don't want you to leave this moment unchanged, because once you start questioning how you see, you can't really go back to seeing the same way again. And as I kept sitting with that discomfort, I realized I couldn't stop at the question of what the single eye might mean, because that question naturally pulled me into something even deeper, something about how we actually see it all. Because once you start questioning perception, you begin to notice that most of us assume we are simply observing reality as it is. But when I reflect on my own experience, I can't honestly say that's always true. There are moments when my mind feels scattered, divided, pulled in different directions at once. In those moments, even simple things feel fragmented. My attention is split, my thoughts contradict each other, and nothing feels fully clear. And then there are other moments, rare ones, where something shifts quietly inside. Not externally. Nothing in the world changes, but the way I experience it does. Everything feels more unified, more direct, almost as if the noise inside has settled, even briefly, and I'm no longer interpreting life through layers of confusion. And that contrast made me start wondering if the teaching about a single eye might not be describing something physical at all, but a state of inner alignment. A way of seeing that is not divided. A perception that is not constantly fractured by fear, memory, expectation, or internal conflict. Because when I look at the phrase again, If your eye is single, your whole body will be full of light. I start to feel that the emphasis might not be on what the eye is, but on what it means for perception to be unified, whole, undivided. And as I explored this further, I found myself less interested in defining it and more interested in observing it in real time within myself. Because I began to notice something simple but important. When my attention is scattered, my inner world feels heavy, conflicted, almost dim in a way that's hard to describe. But when my attention becomes steady, even for a moment, there is a kind of clarity that appears without effort. Not as something I create, but something I become aware of when the noise settles. And I started asking myself whether this might be closer to what ancient spiritual language was trying to point toward. Not a new belief, not a system, but a way of seeing life from a more unified center of awareness. And I want to be honest here. I am not trying to turn this into a conclusion. I'm not trying to say this is the definitive interpretation of anything. I'm simply noticing a pattern in how symbolic language often works across different traditions. It doesn't always aim to describe something literally. Sometimes it points toward an internal experience that words can only approximate. And that's where things started to shift for me personally. Because once you begin to consider perception itself as something that can be fragmented or unified, you start to look at your own inner life differently. You start noticing how easily attention gets pulled in multiple directions. How quickly the mind splits reality into judgment, fear, desire, and interpretation. And in that fragmentation, something subtle seems to get lost. Not in an obvious way, but in the sense that clarity becomes harder to access. So when I return to the idea of a single eye, I no longer think of it as a mystery to solve. I think of it as a question being gently placed in front of us. What would it mean to see life without that internal division? What would it feel like to perceive without constantly breaking experience into competing narratives? And I find myself sitting with that question longer than I expected. Not because I have an answer, but because something about the question itself feels like it is pointing inward, asking to be experienced rather than explained. And that is where this part of the journey begins to open into something even deeper. And as I stayed longer with that idea of a unified way of seeing, something else began to surface in me. Something I couldn't ignore anymore. Because once you start observing perception itself, you eventually begin to notice what perception is directed toward. And that naturally brings you to a deeper question about where all of this experience is actually taking place within us. And this is where my attention slowly shifted into something I had always heard about, but never really considered in this way before. The idea of the human being as a kind of inner structure. A living system of meaning, awareness, and connection, where physical language is used to describe something that may also be symbolic at the same time. When I first encountered the phrase, "You are the temple," I honestly used to hear it as poetic language. Something inspirational, but not necessarily something to examine too deeply. But when I held it alongside everything we've been reflecting on so far, something about it started to feel different. Not as a statement about buildings or religious systems, but as a way of describing where spiritual experience is actually located. Inside us. And I want to be careful here, because I'm not trying to replace one literal interpretation with another. I'm not trying to say, this means exactly that. Instead, I'm trying to sit with the possibility that this kind of language may be pointing toward inner experience rather than external structure. Because when I reflect on my own life, I start to notice how often I look outward for meaning, for direction, for clarity, while rarely pausing to observe the inner space where all of that is actually being processed. Thoughts arise there. Emotions rise and fall there. Meaning is constructed there. Confusion and clarity both emerge from there. And yet, most of the time, we treat that inner space as background noise, rather than the primary place where life is actually being experienced. So when I read the idea of the body as a temple, I begin to understand it less as symbolism and more as a shift in attention. A reminder to look at what has always been present but rarely observed directly. And in that sense, the temple is not something external that we enter. It is something we are already inside of. This perspective quietly changes the way I relate to my own experience, because instead of thinking of spiritual life as something separate from daily living, it becomes something embedded in it. Not somewhere else, but here. Not later, but now. And as I stayed with this reflection, I also started noticing how easily we divide ourselves internally. There is the part of us that feels, the part that thinks, the part that reacts, the part that observes. And often these parts don't move in harmony. They compete. They pull in different directions. They create internal tension that we often normalize as just being human. But what if this fragmentation is exactly what ancient symbolic language was trying to point toward? Not as a flaw to condemn, but as a condition to become aware of. Because if perception can become more unified, as we explored earlier, then perhaps this inner structure can also become more coherent. Not perfect, not controlled, but more aligned. And when I sit with that idea, I start to see why temple language might have been used at all. A temple, in its symbolic sense, is not just a place. It is an ordered space, a place where attention is gathered, where meaning is not scattered, but focused, where presence is not divided into unrelated fragments. And if we apply that inwardly, it suggests something subtle but powerful, that there is a possibility of inner coherence, a way of being where thought, emotion, and awareness are not constantly in conflict, but begin to exist in relationship with each other. I'm not saying this is easy. In fact, I find the opposite to be true. Most of the time, I experience myself as divided, pulled into reaction, memory, interpretation, distraction. But even noticing that division changes something, because awareness itself becomes a kind of stabilizing point. And slowly, I begin to understand why this idea of the body as a temple might have endured across so many interpretations. Not because it points to a structure we must believe in, but because it points to an experience we can potentially recognize within ourselves. And once that recognition begins, even in a small way, it naturally leads us somewhere deeper still. And as I continued sitting with the idea that the human being might be understood as an inner temple of awareness, something began to shift again, almost naturally, as if one question was quietly leading me into another. Because once you start considering the inner world as a structured space of perception and attention, you inevitably begin to wonder about the quality of what fills that space. Not just thoughts, but the deeper current underneath them. Not just emotions, but the awareness that notices those emotions. And this is where my reflection moved into something I didn't expect to take so seriously at first. The idea of an inner light. Now I want to be honest with you again, because when I first heard language like this, I used to treat it as purely poetic. Symbolic language meant to inspire, not necessarily to investigate. But the more I stayed with everything we've been exploring together, the more I started to notice a pattern in how human experience actually feels from the inside. There are moments when clarity seems to appear on its own, not because we force it, not because we analyze harder, but because something inside becomes still enough for perception to feel unobstructed. And in those moments, it genuinely feels as if something is lit within awareness itself. Not externally, not physically in a literal sense, but experientially. Like the difference between a room filled with scattered shadows and the same room when the light has quietly been turned on. Nothing outside necessarily changes, but everything becomes easier to see. And that contrast made me start reflecting on why so many spiritual traditions across time have used language connected to light, vision, illumination, and awakening. Not as a coincidence of style, but as a shared attempt to describe something very difficult to put into ordinary language. Because inner experience doesn't always translate cleanly into physical terms, so it gets expressed through metaphor, symbol, and layered meaning. And when I began to look at it this way, I stopped asking whether these images were meant to be taken literally or dismissed entirely. Instead, I started asking what kind of experience they might be pointing toward. Because in my own observation, there is a clear difference between a mind that is overloaded and a mind that is quiet enough to perceive clearly. When the mind is overwhelmed, everything feels dense, thoughts overlap, attention fragments. Even simple decisions feel heavier than they should. But when the mind settles, even briefly, something else becomes available. A kind of clarity that doesn't feel manufactured. It feels revealed. And I began to wonder if this is what ancient language was trying to gesture toward when it spoke about light entering or filling a person. Not as an external force coming in, but as a way of describing the experience of clarity emerging when internal noise diminishes. And as I stayed with that idea, I also began noticing something else in myself. That most of the time, I don't experience life as a single, unified field of awareness. I experience it as layers competing for attention. There is the layer of thought, constantly analyzing. The layer of emotion, constantly reacting. The layer of memory, constantly referencing the past. And the layer of awareness itself, quietly observing everything else. And the tension between those layers often creates what we experience as inner confusion or emotional heaviness. But in rare moments, those layers seem to align. Not disappear, but align. And in that alignment, perception feels clearer, almost as if everything is finally pointing in the same direction. And those moments, however brief, feel significant enough that I can't dismiss them as random. They feel like glimpses of a different way of being. Not a supernatural state, but a more integrated one. A state where awareness is not constantly pulled apart by internal division. And this is where the idea of inner light begins to feel less like a mystical claim and more like a language attempting to describe integration of perception, a unified experience of being present without fragmentation. And I want to be careful again, because I am not trying to define this as something fixed or absolute. I'm sharing it as something I've been observing within my own experience, and something I think many of us may recognize if we pay close attention. Because once you notice these shifts, even subtly, you can't unnotice them. You begin to see how often clarity depends not on gaining more information, but on reducing internal noise. And that realization quietly changes the direction of everything we've been exploring. Because if clarity is already available in moments of inner stillness, then the question is no longer about finding something new. It becomes about understanding what prevents us from seeing what is already here. And that question is where everything begins to deepen once again. And as I continued reflecting on what might block or reveal clarity within us, I began to realize that this entire journey naturally leads into a final question I couldn't avoid anymore. If these moments of inner clarity feel so real, even if they are brief, then what are we actually experiencing when we move between clarity and confusion, between awareness and what feels like disconnection? Because something deeper started to emerge in my understanding here. The idea that what we call awakening might not be about becoming something entirely new, but about recognizing a shift in state that has always been available within human experience. And this is where everything we've been exploring begins to converge. Because if perception can become unified, if the inner world can become more coherent, and if clarity appears naturally when internal noise settles, then the question of awakening starts to feel less like a distant spiritual concept and more like a lived psychological reality, something we move in and out of without always realizing it. I've noticed in my own experience that there are moments when life feels automatic, almost like I'm reacting rather than fully present. Thoughts move quickly, emotions rise and fall, and attention gets pulled outward constantly. And in those moments, it doesn't feel like I am fully here, even though I am functioning, thinking, and acting. But then there are other moments, sometimes unexpectedly simple ones, where something shifts. Attention becomes quieter. The inner commentary slows down. And I feel, even if briefly, a kind of presence that is more direct than thought. And in those moments, there is a sense of being awake in a way that is difficult to describe through logic alone. Not because something external changed, but because the way I was relating to experience changed. And this contrast made me start wondering whether what we often call sleep and awakening in spiritual language might actually be describing these internal shifts in awareness. Not physical sleep, but states of consciousness where we are either absorbed in fragmentation or resting in clarity. And if that is even partially true, then awakening is not something far away in time or space. It is something that happens in the very quality of attention itself, in how we are present, in how we see, in how unified or divided our awareness feels in any given moment. And I don't say this as a final conclusion. I say it as something I keep noticing the more I pay attention to my own inner experience. Because the more I observe it, the more I realize that these shifts are subtle, but constant. And that realization changes the entire direction of the question from what is awakening to when am I most fully present to what is already here. And that is where this part of the journey begins to open into something even more direct, something we can no longer only think about, but must quietly recognize within ourselves. When I try to gather everything we've explored together, it becomes clear that this journey is not really about reaching a final explanation, but about learning how to see differently from within our own experience. And maybe the most important realization is that nothing we've discussed exists outside of the way we are present to it. The idea of a single eye, the notion of inner unity, the sense of the body as a temple, and even this language of inner light and awakening all seem to point back to one simple but difficult truth, that the quality of our awareness shapes the reality we live inside of. And I find myself returning to something very human in all of this. Not theory, not interpretation, but lived experience. Because when life feels fragmented, it is not the world that necessarily changes, but the way I am holding it. My attention becomes divided, my thoughts compete, and everything feels heavier than it is. But when something inside settles, even briefly, there is a shift that is almost impossible to explain fully with words. The same world is still there, but it is experienced differently, more clearly, more quietly, more whole. And this is where I begin to understand that what we are really talking about is not a distant spiritual achievement, but a very immediate possibility that exists within ordinary life. The possibility of returning to presence. Not as a permanent state we must force ourselves into, but as something we can recognize again and again in small moments of awareness. Moments where we are no longer fully pulled into reaction. Moments where we are not lost in internal division. Moments where we simply notice what is already here without adding so much noise on top of it. And perhaps that is what all of this language has been trying to guide us toward in its own way. Not to create a belief system, but to invite a shift in attention. A shift from fragmentation toward wholeness, from distraction toward clarity, from unconscious living toward conscious awareness. And if I bring this back to my own experience, I can't honestly say I live in that clarity all the time. I don't. Most of us don't. But I can say that noticing the difference has changed how I relate to myself, to my thoughts, and to the moments of life as they unfold. Because once you recognize that awareness itself can feel more unified or more divided depending on how present you are, something inside naturally begins to value presence more deeply. Not as an obligation, but as a return. And maybe that is where the real transformation begins. Not in becoming someone else, but in becoming more aware of how we are already experiencing this very moment. So, the invitation I want to leave you with is not to accept a conclusion, but to observe your own experience a little more closely. Not to believe something new, but to notice what is already happening within you when you slow down enough to see it. Because in that simple act of noticing, something very subtle but very real begins to reveal itself. And perhaps that is enough for now.